Hey everyone, really nice to meet you all here digitally. I can see your comments in the right side, so I will have some questions for you. So please feel free to chat in the comments. I will be checking it occasionally. Today, we're going to talk about React 19. And through this talk, you will know every change that comes to the React ecosystem. So hopefully, you're prepared to take on a new version of React. By the way, in case you missed it, React 19 is now in the RC stage, which means that it is the release candidate stage. It's not ready for app developers yet. So if you're working at a company using React, not ready to move to React 19 just yet. However, it's ready for library authors, which means that if you are writing a library, now may be a good time to upgrade your library to React 19 and check out the new features that's coming. The idea is to get experience with these features and prepare your libraries for React 19. If you are a React developer and hoping to upgrade to React 19, I would actually first suggest you to upgrade to React 18.3. So, why are we doing this talk if it's not ready yet? I feel like React and just front end in general is such a fast pacing field, and there are so many rapid changes that come that I feel like every time a new feature comes out or a new version comes out, I'm just like, okay, let's jump on to the next new shiny thing. And what's this? What's in this new thing? And can I take my computer or can I take my website and my company to the newest version? But I feel like with all these changes, it can be so hard to keep up with React, but just front end in general. And so through this talk, my goal is to bring you all of those changes that are coming to React 19 and simplify it so you're ready to take on React 19. And so in this presentation, we're going to talk about everything you need to know about React 19 as an app developer. And specifically, we'll talk about what's new, what's changing, and then do a quick demo of a simplified version of converting a React 18 form to React 19 form. Even though this is a simple form, this will still give you idea of what the main features of React 19 are, such as React Actions, and also introduce you to two new hooks that comes with React 19, which is use action state and use form status. We'll talk about the theory and like what these things are and the concepts in a few minutes, but just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Before I start talking about what React 19 is, I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Shruti Kapoor. I am a front-end engineer at Slack. You can find me on the internet at Shruti Kapoor 08, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or YouTube, or on TikTok as well. So, if you've ever attended any of my talk, you know what's coming. It's dev jokes. So the way this works is I'll ask you some question and you can leave the answer down in the comments and let me open that up right here. And the way this works is I'll ask you a question. It's gonna be like a funny question, and then you put like nerdy answers. You put whatever comes to your mind. Doesn't have to be right. Doesn't have to be wrong. Whatever comes to your mind. So, first question: what is a React developer's favorite workout? You can put the answer down in the comment section. Hook shots. Oh, I like that. Boxing and sleep. Ooh, sleep is nice. Hook. Actually, hook is pretty good. Boxing. It's lifting state. Okay, next question. How did HTML get drunk? Drilling props? That's a good one. HTML got drunk by having too many beers. Okay. By drinking coffee script. It drank too many tags. Oh, that's a good one. It got hydrated. Very nice. Thank you so much, folks. If you know a dev joke, please send it to me on GitHub. Create a pull request, create a dev joke. So I know some of you might be thinking, hey, I came here for React 19. Let's talk about React 19 already. Okay, so let's talk about the new features of React 19. So we're going to talk about in discussing what comes new with React. The I feel like it can be broadly divided into three categories, which is new features, new hooks, and new API. And then we're going to talk about new features for a little bit because one of the main features that comes with React 19 is React Actions, which actually makes it much easier to handle forms. I feel like with React 19, forms are finally getting the support that they've needed in long term. If you're familiar with PHP or Remix, actions will feel familiar. But let's take a look at what it means and what does an action mean. So typically, this is how we handle like an input field currently. We'll have a button, we'll have an input field, we'll have like a set name. We'll usually attach the set names to on change event handlers. And then the button is kind of doing the job of submitting the input field. So right now here I have a div, but you can imagine if you replace the div with a form element, this is exactly how a form element would work as well. And then if you have any error fields, you would do a check on error and display the error. And similarly, if you want to display a loading state, typically what we do is we'll have like within the handle submit function itself, we'll manually set loading to false, which is like set is pending to we'll set the loading to true, which is set is pending to true, and that starts showing like a loader state. Then if we have any errors, we'll catch errors. If you want to call any APIs, we'll call any APIs. And then once all of that is done, we'll set the is pending to false, which turns off the loader, and then we'll redirect the form if we need to. So in React 18, a new feature was introduced called Start Transition. By a show of hands, actually, not hands, by a show of yes, just tell me if you have ever heard of start transitions or used start transitions in React 18. I'm looking at comments again. So if you've used start transition, let me know by saying yes. Okay, David has used it. Cool. Carl has used it. Luca has used it. Cool. So a few of you are familiar with it. I'm getting the feeling that not everybody is familiar with it. So I'll talk about it really briefly. So strat transition is actually a new hook that is introduced in React 18, not 19, that actually helps us mark certain updates as urgent. What does that mean? Let's say that you're searching for something in like Google, you want to type something in the field. And if you've typed something, there are two types of feedback going on. One is the user actually typing like a letter A, B, C. And then the other feedback is also Google looking up that search term. So if you look for React, it'll be looking up for React and then showing you the display back, which is a set of fields that kind of matches React or like the search phrase that you've sent. So there's two types of feedback going on. However, there's one feedback that's more important than the other feedback, which is showing the user that they've actually typed in the character. And that is called an urgent update. So that is more important than showing the search results. So in React 18, we can mark certain updates as urgent by putting non-urgent updates at in start transition hook. So this is where start transition comes from. This is React 18 hook, which helps you mark certain updates as urgent by putting non-urgent updates within start transition. Now, the difference between React 18's version of Start Transition and 19's version is that in 19, you can actually put async functions within Start Transition as well. So here, if you see in Handle Summit, what I've done is I have a Start Transition hook, and I'm putting an async function within the Start Transition. Now, why I talked about this in detail is because that async function is an action. So simply speaking, action is really just the async function that's going inside of that start transition hook. It doesn't have to be within a start transition hook, but that is the async function that's going within the start transition hook. So simply speaking, functions that use async transitions are called actions. And a good thing about actions is that it's also supported on the server, so you can use it for RSCs as well. Now, why this helps us is because now instead of doing a form and then using a button to handle the event handling of submitting, you can instead attach action to the form element itself. This might feel very familiar to you if you are from PHP or if you've used Remix. So now you can just add action and it'll take care of submitting the form. No need of handling handle submit anymore. No need of attaching a, click handler to the form. So you can just attach an action right away. There's also another hook that really helps in this action, in extracting the information out of the action, which is called use form status. And the specific data that it gives us back, which is really helpful, is the pending attribute, the data attribute, and the action attribute. We'll look at this in a second, but for now, all you need to know is React Actions help in improving the user experience of form by automatically submitting the form using the action. So you don't have to manually track pending states, you don't have to manually create loading states, and you don't have to manually submit the form using on-click handler. So that was React Actions. In summary, it really improves the experience of forms. There's another thing that's being introduced with the new React 19 updates, which is the React compiler. React compiler actually does not come as part of the package of React 19, but is rather a new plugin. So you have to install it separately. But the helpful thing about React compiler is that it actually automatically memoizes your code. Oftentimes in your code, you may have noticed that you have used memo and use callbacks everywhere. You don't need it anymore. You don't need to memorize your code manually anymore. You can just use React compiler. If you're not familiar with use callback, it kind of looks like this. It has helped to like memorize and perform and make performance optimizations. Use callback specifically is used for functions, whereas use memo is used for values. With React compiler, you don't need to use memo and use callback anymore. So you don't have to wrap your functions anymore because it performs auto memorizations, which basically means that it'll figure out which function should be cached and automatically use their result. Another thing is that if your code base currently already has use memo or callback, you probably are already well memoized, hopefully. But if not, if you are already well memoized, you may not see a lot of performance changes. But if you're not using use memo, use callback appropriately or wherever it needs to, the React compiler will automatically figure out where it needs to and already improve the performance optimization as well. The way compiler improves performances and automatises code is by optimizing re-renders. So there's two things specifically that it does. We'll look at it in right now. The number one thing is it helps in skipping re-rendering of children when parent updates. And this is really cool because currently you'll see that anytime React will re-render all of the component and all of its children's, like anytime React will re-render component, all of its children will re-update or re-render unless you have manually memoized code with like use memo or use callback. So for example, in this case, in this friends list component, you'll see that anytime friends changes, which is the top thing which is the top parameter that's being passed to friends list, the component in the bottom, which is message button, that would also re-render, even though it is not dependent on friends. But with React compiler, it figures out that message button doesn't need to re-render. It also figures out the return value of friends list card and if it's dependent on a friend that has changed, and it can be reused, thereby decreasing the re-renders of the child components. The second optimization it does is by skipping expensive calculations. And compiler helps to skip calculations of expensive components because it can use its knowledge of JavaScript and React's rules to automatically memorize values or groups of values within your components and hooks. And the way this works is because it'll only memorize. There's one caveat to this, which is that it'll only memorize React components and hooks and not every function. Um, and an example for that is here. So let's say that you have a really expensive function, which is at the top of your like component. It is outside a React component. It would not be memoized. So because this expensive process is outside the table container, which is the React's boundary, the React component, that function expensive process would not be memoized. So it's kind of your job to figure out anyway, in this case, which is to figure out if your function is expensive and how to memorize that. However, if you use that expensive function within your component, it comes within the boundaries of the React compiler. And now the data that comes back out of the expensive process, that will be automatically memoized, even though you have not written use memo here anymore. So it's really cool because even if we do manual memoization ourselves, you may have noticed that there are a lot of places where you forget to put use memo or use callback. So this is really nice because React compiler can automatically take care of that for you. So one less thing to worry about, which honestly was a big performance optimization that we had to do manually. And I'm so glad that React compiler can automatically take care of it for me because I could not for I could not keep track of where use memo and use callback had to go. And then you would have to kind of do your measurements, which to see like how much productivity changes, like how much optimization it was causing. So it's really nice that compiler can take care of it for you. Now, one thing that I mentioned is that it actually figures out which component to memorize by looking at the rules of React. And in order to figure out like which component has been memoized or not, it comes with a very handy playground, which kind of looks like this. So on the left is the component that you're using, or the component that you have created, and on the right is the code that's been generated by the compiler. To understand which function has been memoized or which component has been memoized, in the playground, you'll see something like dollar equals underscore C. And that is a great sign that that code has been memoized. That means that the compiler has gone through this code and optimized it. So if you're ever wondering if your component is following the rules of React and if it has been memoized, Playground can be really helpful there. So basically, you don't need to use memo and use callback anymore. But what if you are like, well, I love memoizing myself. I don't want to use compiler. Using compiler is kind of the go-to way to go memoirs. However, there's one difference between the way use memo and use callback, use memo, use callback memoizes and compiler memoizes. The difference is in the underlying way memoization is done using use memo, use callback, and compiler. So you might see some performance differences, but it shouldn't be too much. However, if you do see a lot of differences, or if you are running into errors in with code that already is use memo, use callback, and uses use compiler, I would highly recommend going to the GitHub working group and posting a discussion there. I will share that in 1 second. But in order to install React compiler, all you have to do is install as an ESLint plugin. Goes part of your Webpack. The working group is this one, which is actually on GitHub. If you search for React Compiler Working Group, you'll be able to find it. And this is where you can post any questions that come up or any issues that arise during the transition from current code to React Compiler code. Okay, so that was React Compiler. Basically, in a nutshell, React Compiler auto memoizes your code, so you don't have to use memo and use callback anymore. Now let's talk about the new hooks that are being introduced in React 19. Some hooks that are being introduced in React 19 are use form status, which actually gives you the information of last form submission. And it's really helpful because it actually gives you like these attributes called pending and data that can be used to get the data out of the form. So for example, if you're submitting 5 fields, the data attribute can be used to get the data that was submitted through the form. Pending is really helpful because it can actually help you create a loading state. So you don't have to create that anymore. You can just check for pending and add a loader if you need to. However, there is one caveat of this hook, which is that it can only be used inside a form's child component. And what that means is in this case, where I have a form at the top and I'm using pending out of use form status within the same component that has the form, that won't work. In order to make it work, I'll have to create a child component, which is actually within the form component where the form element was there. So now I have a submit component, which is a child component, and in that child component, I can use form status. This is just one thing that I would flag for anybody who has maybe like design systems, which is already created components. If you want to use form status, you're going to have to create child components. Same with use action state. Use action state is also another hook that's really helpful in getting information, which is state based on an action. And this can be helpful because it gives you back the state that was changed after an action was performed. And the action here is the form action that can be used to hook up with a form like this. So I was talking about that. Now you can just simply add an action to a form. This is where that action comes from. It comes from the use action state. We'll take a look at both of this in just a minute to take a look at how this actually works in action. But for now, we'll also talk about the use optimistic hook, which is introduced in React 19, which actually helps to optimistically update UI. This was something that we were doing manually as well before, but now it's really helpful that use optimistic can do it for us. Optimistic rendering, in case you're unfamiliar, is kind of a way of immediately showing a response to the user, which is kind of like a best guess scenario. So if somebody was, let's say, searching for React, and then you want to show you're still looking up, you're still sending that information to the API and it's still looking up. Meanwhile, during that transition phase, you can optimistically update UI by showing like a search field such as React is cool or React 19. So you can show a search phase or show a list or show any search, any item, or show a UI field based on what you think would be the best case scenario of submitting that form. So that's how use optimistic helps us. It also gives you back the optimistic state, which is how you want the data to be updated based on the optimistic value, and the add optimistic function. There's also a new API that's been added in React 19, which is the use API, which can be, it kind of looks like a hook, but it's actually an API. And it can be used to read resources. And the specific resources that I think it is really helpful in reading is context. We know context, to read context, you have to actually wrap it between providers. But with the help of use, you don't need to use context providers anymore. Like in this component, you can just use use, get the data out, and keep going. It can also be used to read promises as well. So if you have a like a comments promise that's been passed, you can use that with the use itself. There is one caveat though that it does not support promises in render. If you try to pass a promise that's created in render to use, React will warn that creating a promise inside a client component is not yet supported. So the caveat is that it can only be called within render. However, there's one thing that unlike hooks, you can call it conditionally because hooks cannot be called conditionally. However, use API can be called conditionally. So in brief, what's new? Um, the new features are React Compiler, comes as a plugin, React Actions, useful for forms, hooks, which is use action state, use form status, and use optimistic, and a new API called use. So those are new features of React 19. Now, what's changed in React 19? One amazing update is that ref is now a prop. Oh my God. How many times I've had issues with this where I pass in a ref and I read the ref and I see that it's undefined. And it used to happen because you had to previously wrap refs with forward refs within your component that you were passing it to. But now you don't have to do it anymore. You're going to be fixing so many bugs without even knowing. So with this update, ref is now a prop and it gets passed in as is. You don't need to use memo and use callback anymore because manual memorization is now not needed with compiler. There are some other updates. Like error rendering is getting better support. In React 19, you can now render context instead of context.provider. You can also use the use API. React also supports the returning a cleanup function from ref callback. Another one that I'm really excited about is the metadata. So now you can actually add metadata for each component specifically. And this can be really helpful, especially if you have like site that depends a lot on SEO, like a blog post site or a site that generates a lot of content or creates a lot of content and you need SEO. So now you can provide meta tags within the component itself, which is really cool because now you can have meta tags for different components. Another really cool update about React 19 is that now it has a better support for style sheets, which is that you can actually define which style sheet should get what precedence. In this case, if you see here, there are two style sheets with the precedence of default and high. If you didn't have precedence, the second style sheet would have a lower precedence than the first style sheet because style sheets are loaded in the order of how they are mentioned. However, by specifying precedence equals high, you can be sure that some of the inline styles you are loading can actually be automatically loaded by React before loading other styles. So precedence can be really helpful. In order to upgrade, you can upgrade simply like you do npm install React, and it will be part of your dependencies. Now let's take a quick look at our demo. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. And this is my demo. Okay, in this demo, hopefully this is legible to everybody, but if not, I'll zoom in a little bit. In this demo, I have a React 18 form. So through this demo, I want to show you how to convert a React 18 form from, I have only one input field here. You'll see here, there's just one input field, but I want to show you how to convert a React 18 form to a React 19 form. And through this, we'll learn the actually two new hooks we've seen, and learn how to wire up a form with an action. So in React 18, currently the way we have a form is we'll have a form element. And then I also talked about like input fields. So we'll typically actually like have an on change handler that takes care of like setting names and setting whatever. If we need a loader, we'll typically have like a is pending flag and check if pending, then show a loader. If not pending, then show the data that you want to show. And then to submit the form, we actually have a button. This is how we do forms right now. No change here. Um, Quickly taking a look at our handle submit function, all it does is sets the is pending to true, which is how we start the loader. And then it'll like call our fake API. And then within the fake API, we're actually setting the, after we've called the API, we're setting the is pending to false. Now, in React 19, the way this changes is, let me comment this out. Okay, in React 19, the way this changes is, I told you that we, instead of having like a submit, instead of submitting the form through a like a div or like a button, we can actually submit the form through the action itself. Now, where does this action come from? I talked about the use action state. This is where that use action state comes from. So we have a use action state. This action state returns back a state and a form action. This is the form action that I'm actually hooking up in the form. Now, this use action state accepts two parameters, which is the action itself, which is how you kind of like perform changes, and then an initial state. Quickly, we'll take a look at the submit form action, which is what we do to change data within this form. And in this form action, all we are doing is it actually accepts two parameters, which is the previous state, so that it can modify it and return the new state, and the form data. Form data is all of the fields that you submitted to the form. This is really helpful because if you want to get like a specific field out of it, you can just do form data dot get in the name of the field. So form data here is actually like this data is actually a form data object, which means to get like a field called input name, you can't just do form data dot input name. You have to do form data dot get input name because it's a form data object. Now, this is how you get information out of any field that was submitted. So if you had any other fields, any other input fields, this is how you can simply get that information out. And then I'm here calling my fake API again, and then I'm just returning the new state. So here, all I'm doing is appending name to the state and just returning that. Very simple form action, doesn't really do anything. Then I have my input field as is before. Notice I'm not adding an on change anymore because I can take care of that through my form action. I also used to have a loader, so I brought back the loader here. And then I'm going to render my name and I'm going to pass the data that comes back from the use action state because this is the hook that gives me back information on what changes changed in the state. So I have it through state and then my submit button. So I talked about that you don't need the submit button. So let's take a look at what's in the submit button actually. All right. So in the button, I'm actually not doing anything. All I'm doing is I'm getting the use form status out to actually disable the pending button. I don't even have an on submit. So all I'm doing here is disable the button in case loading state is going on, so we don't actually show the user that something is happening. And once this button is clicked, the form action will automatically take care of submitting the form. Now, in order to render data on the page, I have this render component where I'm just looking for the pending state, and I've gotten the data back out of the name parameter, and I'm rendering this. So it looks super simple. You might feel like there might be a lot of changes. So let me show it to you side by side, showing what's the difference between React 19 and React 18 form. Let me uncomment this and uncomment this. Okay, so on the left, I have my React 18 form. Let me make it smaller. And on the right, I have my React 19 form. Make it smaller a bit. Hopefully it's still legible. If not, please tell me. Okay, so this is my React 18 form. I'm going to zoom it in a bit. This is my React 18 form. I used to have a form and I used to have a button through which I would submit. In React 19, I have a form wired up with an action. Button doesn't really do anything except it only has like a disabled state. In order to show loaders, I used to have an is pending, which I would be manually setting to true and then setting it to false. However, in React 19, in my loader component, I can get that data out of use form status. And all I need to do is look for pending. I don't even have to track it anymore. Use form status will do it for me. And then all I do is look for pending and add loading state. So that's the difference between React 18 form and React 19 form. Hopefully, it was simple enough and you could understand the difference between the two forms and how to use the two different hooks, use form status, and use action state. Okay, so that was a demo. To quickly recap what we talked about, forms are getting a better support in React 19. It's now becoming much easier to manage pending states because you don't have to manually track it anymore. The new hooks can do it for you. With the help of React compiler, you don't need to use memo, use callbacks anymore. There's no more forward refs, thank God. Refs is now just a prop, and you get the data out as soon as you pass it. You don't need to have forward refs anymore. There's few updates that I didn't get a chance to talk about, so I'm gonna pause on this for 1 second in case anybody wants to take a screenshot. These are all of the updates of React 19. So I'll pause here for 1 second. Okay, so one last thing before I quit, one last thing before I end. Um, if you've ever thought of giving a conference talk and you might be feeling intimidated, I just want to tell you that it's a lot easier than you think. I have created some resources if you're ever thinking of speaking at conferences. Um, this conference, honestly, is a really great conference for you to speak at as well. It was very easy. It's a lot easier to speak in front of a camera like this instead of speaking in front of like a really huge audience. So if you're ever thinking of getting in started with speaking at conferences, this is a really great conference to speak at. I also have a few tips that I've given on my YouTube channel if you're ever interested. If you need tips on how to get started, or if you're just in that doubt, like I submitted some talks but they didn't go through, please send me a DM. I'll try my best to help you out and help you submit an CFP. With that, thank you so much, everyone, for showing up and for participating in the chat. The link to the slides I will post as well later on. But before I go, I have one final thing I want to share. One final dev joke. How does a developer cheer? Hip hip hooray! Thank you so much, everyone.
That was a
a
great
great talk.
talk. Yeah, great talk, Shruti. Hey, I said it first. Jinx. No.
That was just your internet. Like wherever you're living, I don't really know it. I think it's just slow.
You know, we did a survey while you were giving your talk, and we asked chat, what version of React are you currently on? 66% of respondents said they are on V18, so version 18. So they're in prime position to upgrade to version 19. So that's kind of cool.
Perfect. I'm so impressed. I'm impressed that most people did not say React 16. Because when you said we did a survey, I was like, okay, most people will still be on React 16. I'm impressed by the audience.
Yeah, there's a poor 9% still on 16. So thoughts and prayers to those folks. But on that note, I think Jan has some questions here for you.
Funny enough, now that you say it, the first question is actually from you. So,
I know that guy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you see folks approaching undo the manual memorization when moving from 18 to 19?
This is a great question. And when I was doing the talk, I was actually thinking of removing all of my use memo, use callbacks to like just React compiler. However, in the guide of React 19, I've seen that what's mentioned is that you can keep your use memo and use callback until compiler is kind of stable, which is still trying to get stable. Because I mentioned that there is some difference between the way memorization is done between use memo, use callbacks and compiler, the way it actually memorizes is different. So what you can do is keep your use memo, you'll callback as of now. And then going forward, all of your new code can be memoized with React compiler. So you don't have to remove it right now.
Oh, very cool. That's very cool. Yep.
Let me put that away. And there was also the question, I'm not sure how far in the planning you already are with that, but if you can share anything, how Slack is transitioning to React 19, I think that's very interesting to our audience because it's a big code base, very relatable to a lot of our users. So
yeah, one thing that comes with big code base is the speed, which is slow. So we are actually currently in the process of migrating to React 18. This is what happens when you work in a really big company. Why I had that kind of meme of this person looking at like React like this, like, oh, that was me because I was involved in transitioning from React 16 to React 18. And I was talking about like what we need to do and what are the changes, and like what we need to deprecate, what are the other libraries. So we are currently in the process. Uh, we're like pretty far along, but we're still migrating from 16 to 18. React 19, since it's not like in stable stage, it's still in RC stage. It's still like far ahead.
Right.
I don't imagine us going there in like the next 2 years, but we'll see how we get there. Forms is actually a really big thing that comes with React 19. And I would say that while I was working at PayPal, that was something that I would have loved to do because most of our stuff was actually really big forms. And with React 19, that would have made my life a lot easier. Slack doesn't have a kind of path to React 19 just yet because we're still moving to React 18.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I think it's pretty common for a big corp to be like always behind one version to just have like
Yeah.
all the big issues ironed out beforehand.
Yeah.
Sweet. We still have time for one more question, and it might be a little bit of a curveball, but there was like this big. So I'm not super into the details on the history, but let me share my screen. You might notice a blog post that might seem familiar to you. So Dominik Dorfmeister, and that's probably the only time where my German heritage allows me to pronounce the name properly. So wrote this blog post about the suspense drama that happened probably by now like half a year ago. And the blog post is very, very detailed. Great blog post. And from my understanding, not being like super deep into the weeds, it was basically like the way that suspense used to work in React 18 and the way that it works now in React 19, and the release candidate changed, leading to a lot of waterfalls, leading to like a lot of like basically like single components being rendered successfully. Do you have any insights of what's going on with that? Because the blog post pretty much ends with the React team is looking into this.
I have not used suspense in that much detail to talk about the waterfall effect. I don't think I've read this blog post, but I've read about this in a different blog post where it talks about like React 19 actually creates a lot more waterfalls now. I can't offer insights into this, unfortunately, but I saw that you shared the link. I'm going to read this after this.
Yes, and before I forget, I can also put this in the chat. It's generally a great blog post. It lines out really well what happens. I was just wondering if there's like any news to that already, because I think the blog post was written in like July.
June.
June.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm going to
Kelly,
check that out.
Kelly, do you have any question, anything you want to know? Always
No,
wanted to
I
know
mean,
about React.
No, I mean, the thing that I learned from your talk today, the meta tags, I know Paul and I have been working with components, especially kind of in a content focused scenario, and having the ability to update the meta tags on a page. I think, oh, thank goodness.
I know, same. I have all these like blog posts that I kind of actually create like React components for them. They're actually really just React components. So being able to specify like meta tags for each of them is going to be so helpful, especially for most of us who create our own like websites and put our blog posts there. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, we need that SEO-ness. So
Yes.
anything to add more meta tags, more open graph values, I'm all for it. So
Yes.
on that note, thank you so much for this talk. I know chat was amazing. They were asking a lot of questions. They're excited. Go back and chat, see what people are saying. And again, if you folks want more of Shruti, be sure to go follow her on YouTube.